another part of your book that I found to be pretty fascinating as well, and it was the role of sex in helping maintain order. A few examples: Maribel Morgan and women being enslaved to their husband. They should know their role. By the way, those were bestsellers. Use sex to a woman's advantage. Keep men home so their sons don't take up what the moms do, or they become a little too feminine, or they just open the door to being gay. Josh McDowell helped launch the purity movement, which actually led to Reagan. We'll get to Reagan in a second. Led to Reagan directing government funding to abstinence-only sex ed. When I think of, again, it opened my eyes to a lot, because when I think of Christianity and I think of Christians, I don't think of like them using sex as a tool, but evangelicals really went knees deep in it.
They did. They did. I when you pitch a book to publishers, right, you send a sample chapter or two. And one of the chapters that I sent was the chapter that you're drawing on here, Maribel Morgan and Tim and Beverly LaHaye and their manuals on, great Christian sex. And these are written in the 60s and 70s. And you're right, Maribel Morgan's book, The Total Woman, sold more than 10 million copies, was the best-selling nonfiction book in 1974, right? These are massive bestsellers. And people forget that. And it's all about having, how Christians have the best sex and how Christian women have to please their men. And in the case of Tim and Beverly LaHaye, they give really detailed instructions for how this is done. And so that I ran into trouble apparently when one of the publishers that my agent pitched this to was a Christian publisher who had some like anti-porn filters in their office, and they could not share the chapter electronically because of the quotes that I had in it from these guys. So yes, it is a common misperception that Christians are a bunch of prudes and, don't want, or according to them, have great sex, but there are rules that you have to follow.
Mm-hmm.
And here too, this gender difference, gender binary opposites is really critical to understanding how sex works. They believe that, God filled men with testosterone, and they have this really insatiable need for sex, and it's aggressive and all of these things. And so restraint is really hard for men. But good thing women are around, and it's on them then to preserve moral virtue. And they have to do that by never tempting or seducing men who are not their husbands, which is very hard because they're, boys will be boys. So women have to observe all of these rules to not tempt men who are not their husbands. But as soon as they get married on that wedding night and forever after, it is on them, their God-given responsibility to fulfill their husband's every sexual need. So what this does, and I'm not making this up, right? It's just the books are just filled with these instructions and with this framework. So what that means is anytime there is an instance of, sexual misconduct on the part of a man, there is always a woman to blame, right? The woman seduced him, even when the victim is a little girl, right? What did she do to seduce him? And the first time I came across this, I'm like, this is just so messed up, and this has got to be an outlier. And then I came across it again and again and again. And his wife, if he's married, also clearly was not fulfilling her role if he had to, go down the hall and look elsewhere to fulfill his needs. This is just horrible to even explain this, but this is kind of a theology of sex that underlies some of these horrific abuse cases that keep making the news. And it's not just, look, there's going to be bad guys everywhere, right? In any system, in any community, there are going to be bad guys. But what we see in these conservative Christian communities so often is that once the abuse or misconduct is exposed, instead of what we might expect to happen, which is the community absolutely condemning this and kicking out the perpetrator, over and over again, it's the opposite that ends up happening. The perpetrator is the one who's defended. He just has to say a quick sorry, if that, and then he's forgiven and he's restored to his position of authority. Meanwhile, the victims are the ones who are blamed and they are driven out of the communities. And you mentioned at the beginning, in passing, Rachel Denhollander,
Hmm.
who was the first witness in the Larry Nassar abuse case with Michigan State University and U.S. Olympic Gymnastics. But then she also spoke out against abuse in conservative Christian churches. And she was widely praised in Christian spaces for what she had done in the Nassar case. But as soon as she turned her attention and called this out inside Christian spaces, she has been literally demonized and just relentlessly attacked now for years by conservative Christian leaders, pastors, and denominations for her advocacy against abuse in Christian churches. And none of this makes sense if you don't understand this theology of authority and submission and sex that is underneath all of this.
There was one thing that it seems is in place. There's many things, of course, but there's one thing that stands out to me as well, which is there is a system that is here, and it is also built around protection. When you were talking about accountability, even when they are caught, all it takes is an apology. And then what I noticed as well that you wrote of is that many of the other evangelical leaders would then stand up for that person that was in the wrong to diffuse the entire situation on the like grooming and pedo stuff. Another thing that stood out to me was they backed Roy Moore. They supported Roy Moore in Alabama. Everybody knows about this at this point because it was a massive upset for a Democrat to win the Senate in Alabama, but it was because they put up freaking Roy Moore to go up against him, and he's awful. So why do they do this? Like, I understand that there are protections that are in place, but wouldn't it just make for a better, healthier cause if they came clean and just said, yeah, we're going to kick this guy out because we don't agree with him grooming a child?
Exactly, right. This is the question. And in fact, I produced a film, a documentary film based on the last chapter of Jesus and John Wayne, which covers this history of abuse. And Roy Moore is in there, and way too many of these predator pastors are in there. And in there, you just see the repeated pattern over and over again of, hey guys, this is an easy call, right? You can just
Right.
you can just pull your support here and you can do the right thing, and yet they do not do the right thing over and again. And initially, kind of the surface level explanation was, especially when a pastor was a perpetrator, that they just cared so much about the, and I quote, the witness of the church, right? And they don't want to make the church look bad, and the church, and
Mhm.
so they cover it up. And I mean, that in and of itself is problematic enough, but what I'm saying is it goes deeper, right? This is not, they are not like agonizing behind closed doors and then just thinking, man, but we can't afford to lose, we can't afford to turn people off from Christ because their salvation is at stake, so we're just going to have to suck this up and and quiet this up. No, that doesn't get at what's actually happening. Too often inside these spaces, the whole system is designed to enable and protect predators. Now, let me clarify, that does not mean that everybody who attends a conservative church is on board with this. And very few people are joining a conservative church because they think this is going to be a great place to be a predator, although, it is a soft target. So you do have some of that going on.
Mhm.
Most people are well intentioned in these spaces, but then they are discipled, we could say, groomed into these practices of submitting to authority, of always protecting and promoting the pastor, the man in authority over you. And they are taught that, if something goes wrong, women are to blame. They are taught that women are the more sinful, the weaker vessels, and all of these things. And that takes hold. And then there's all kinds of community pressure to fall in line. What we see is it's not just the victims who are pushed out, but anybody inside the church, no matter how upstanding they are, how respected they are, they end up, if you back the victim, life becomes hell. You lose your friends, you lose your church, you lose your place in the community. And these are not one-off situations. There's this absolutely fantastic podcast out right now called The Sons of Patriarchy that looks at Doug Wilson's spaces. Again, this is Pete Hegseth attends one of the churches in this denomination. And these teachings of patriarchy and allowing for not reckoning with abuse that is rampant in these spaces. This podcast has the story of dozens of women telling who've been in these spaces for 10, 20 years or more, telling horrific stories of what this looks like on the ground. And these patterns are so very consistent.
It's interesting that you bring up Pete Hegseth once again. Not included in the book, but when you saw him confirmed, what was your reaction?
A poster boy for Jesus and John Wayne in almost every way. But if I could find one guy today who embodies what I'm talking about in Jesus and John Wayne, hands down, it's Pete Hegseth.